Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us for this session of Unearthed, the Power of Gardening. It's very warm, so I hope you're all sufficiently cool, but over the next hour we're going to have a very rich and hopefully thought-provoking discussion on the lesser known histories, I suppose, of gardens and green spaces around the world, but also how these spaces have been and continue to be sometimes sites of conflict, resistance, but also places of healing, transformation, communities, and restoration. Now, if you haven't seen the exhibition, I strongly urge you to take a look. It's literally just off the lobby. There's a lot to get through in the next hour, but I thought we'd start first with you, Antonia, as a co-curator of the exhibition. Why did you and the British Library decide to do this exhibition? What was the inspiration behind it?
Well, it wasn't like an obvious inspiration of a commemoration or, an event, but I think it was just a sense that gardening was having a moment. And perhaps the reason why it was having a moment was because of the effects of lockdown. We conceived this in about 2023, I think, and people were just emerging. And I think that the sort of sense that people were turning towards their gardens in times of hardship, it spoke to the current culture, if you like. So what inspired us, I think, was nothing more than a sort of sense of trying to catch the moment. But I should also add that it's often been the case, people don't realise, people think of the resources for gardening as stored at Kew Gardens, Royal Horticultural Society, these sort of places. The British Library is awash with materials of interest to gardeners, and they're not often exposed to the public. People don't often come to look at them, and so we thought, well, why not for a summer exhibition just bring some of this little known stuff out and enjoy it.
Now, your exhibition covers a whole host of different types of gardens, allotments, green spaces, and we'll go into that over the course of the talk. But Matt, I just wanted to bring you in here because the Aga Khan Foundation has done for the last 30 years a huge restoration of Islamic gardens across the world. Why did they choose to do that? Why the focus on gardens in particular?
Well, there's several reasons. So, I think one is that, we work with gardens in two ways. So the first is through something called the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and our Historic Cities program, which is focused on the restoration of historic monuments, Islamic monuments in the Islamic world. And then we also use gardens as a tool for development in our rural development programs and urban programs elsewhere. And so in the Historic Cities program, if you're going to work on Islamic monuments, almost by definition you will be working on gardens. Why is that? The Quran is awash with descriptions of paradise as a garden. There are 4 rivers: water, milk, wine, honey, fruit. It sounds lovely. And so therefore, when forts and palaces were built over time, they always included a sort of paradise garden. And in fact, so the word paradise, I understand, comes from Persian, and it actually means a sort of walled enclosure. So that's one reason. The other reason is that's also very interesting. So you not only were gardens this representation of paradise inside these sites, they were also spaces for scientific exploration. And so for one of the things for us, one of the reasons to be engaged in the restoration of Islamic monuments is to emphasize this history, this heritage in Islam, both of its pluralism, and so its plurality across multiple countries and interpretation and sites, but the second is actually this pursuit of knowledge. And so the notion that by pursuing knowledge today, in the here and now, you prepare yourself for the afterworld. And if you think about it in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, gardens were actually sites for scientific exploration and technology. So it's a mix of all of those things. And lastly is that today, why are they relevant today? Because the whole purpose of the Historic Cities program is to restore these sites so that they can be places for development of the people and the communities around them today. One of the things we find in a lot of these places, So if you look at the things we've done in Delhi, or you look at the things that we've done in Cairo or elsewhere, oftentimes these historic sites were surrounded by dilapidated slums, quote unquote. So what we've tried to do is actually make them engines of economic opportunity for the people that are there, but also places for them to go. One of the challenges in many of these places is that there aren't enough open garden green spaces in urban places. There's lots more to say, but I'll stop
We'll
there.
go on to that. Now, Sue, out of all of us, you are the only professional gardener on this panel. I'm very much an amateur gardener. But this is a second career for you, right? Because your first career was in finance. What drew you away from that and into gardening in particular?
Yes, I came into gardening as a career changer. Prior to that, I was in financial services in the city. And I suppose I was searching for something deeper, and I wanted more connection to being outdoors, being connected to the seasons, and I just felt quite stifled in my office life, and I wanted to make a change. And I was drawn towards gardening because, I wanted to feel like I was doing something more important, more connected. And I think the thing that actually swung it for me, I was kind of quite miserable in my office life anyway. And I was sitting in my apartment in the East End of London, and there was this kind of very bare waste area in front of our apartment, and at the end of it there was a weed. And one day I was sitting there staring out, and then this bird landed on this plant, and it was bright yellow and red, and as a full-grown adult I had no idea what this bird was or what this plant was. And
the bird was bright yellow and red?
The bird was bright yellow and red, and the plant was like this weedy green with this tiny little insignificant flower on the top. And I had no idea what the plant was or what the bird was. And on top of all these other thoughts and feelings I'd been having anyway, I just thought it just felt so wrong. And I kind of felt, what could be more important or urgent than having this kind of connection, having that kind of knowledge and relationship, which I didn't have.
And so did you have any experience of gardening before you made the change?
I grew up in a council house. My parents worked every hour of the day practically. They had one day off a week, and they had no time to look after the garden, so I didn't have any of that modelled for me. But my dad, they both loved, it was clear to me that they both loved nature, they both loved plants, but they just didn't have any capacity, energy or time to nurture that side of their interest. So I have vague memories of taking, you get free seed packets on the front of magazines, and I remember one time taking these lettuce seeds and throwing them in this dry, barren, not very nice looking earth underneath a window, and then a week or so later they sprouted, and I remember feeling amazed and delighted. And I remember kind of roaming around. I was quite a feral child, because my parents didn't have time to watch me all the time. I remember roaming around our kind of village and countryside. I grew up in quite a rural area, and exploring with my bum bag on. So I remember that kind of nature connection. But no, I have no romantic kind of story of my parents growing loads of roses and doing loads of veg gardening. That just wasn't in my past.
It's interesting because you talk about this need to reconnect with nature and, I guess, pursue something more tangible and meaningful. And Antonia, the exhibition focuses a lot on the restorative nature of gardens. Can you tell us all a bit more about it and what you found?
Yes, when you're creating an exhibition, I think you're slightly sort of guided by what you've got actually in the collections, and so themes emerge organically rather than one imposing a structure of what the story one wants to tell. The story suggests itself. And I think one theme that came out particularly, which surprised me, was the common occurrence of gardening in times of confinement, where one is somewhere where one would rather not be, if you like. And so, for example, in the India Office records, we've got plans of soldiers' gardens, and soldiers in India were confined to barracks between campaigns. They had nothing to do, and they were stuck there for sort of 16 hours a day. And the colonial masters felt that trouble would ensue if they weren't given something productive to do. And it's quite interesting looking at the story of the soldiers' gardens that was set up in these cantonments, and competition, those with the best flowers and this sort of thing, to keep the soldiers occupied, who would rather be anywhere but there. And once one looked for confinement stories, one found them everywhere. Books about gardening in refugee camps, people who feel completely displaced. We've got pictures of the camp in Calais, for example, where people have made staked out little areas of garden around to make them feel more secure and at home. And as somebody said, if I see a piece of green, I think of home. Gardening in prison is something else. One of our exhibits is what they call a prisoner's herbal, and this was created by a prisoner who was imprisoned in 2010. And in prison, obviously one's personal health is quite neglected. All one has is the prison yard. But looking around the yard, she saw chickweed, she saw dandelion, she saw nettles creeping up through the cracks in the concrete. She felt, what can I do with this? I can gather them. I can use them to help my own nutrition. As we know, dandelions are full of vitamin D, and they're good for you. And I can use them to make herbal medicines to help my fellow prisoners. I think she used a medicine for menstrual cramps or something. And she called these plants, it was rather lovely, she called them her plant allies. And when she was released from prison, she actually trained as a herbalist. But I thought it was a lovely story of how confinement can turn you to gardening. And I mean, we have other examples, gardening. I won't go into them now, but we've got a map of the garden at Bedlam Hospital. Bedlam, the notorious hospital for psychiatric patients. But in the early 19th century, people were envisaging a slightly kinder way of caring for mental patients by giving them gardens and pleasant places to walk in. So we have a map that's a little ahead of its time. And gardens, yes, gardens for confinement in perhaps in a very poor environment as well. If one's confined to one's room and one can't get out, there's a lovely book, Gardens for the Poor, which just explains you how to grow a pot plant in your home. So all that range, I felt a theme emerged, if you like, of the restorative power of. And these are people, it's quite interesting, we were discussing the other day, but this is both socially and in isolation. Restorative power by coming together, perhaps, to grow a garden, and we're going to talk about that later, but also if you are confined against your will, solitarily, you're drawing on your own resources, and the earth can help you do that, one felt. So that was a theme that emerged.
This theme and the idea of restorative nature of gardening and the natural world, how is that modelled, I guess, in the restoration of the Islamic gardens around the world?
So I think for the work that we do, wherever we are, so let me take a couple of examples. So one, I'll start in Cairo, but I promise I'll come to Delhi for all of you who've seen us there. But so one of the very first gardens that we restored was in Cairo. It's called the Al-Azhar Park, if any of you have ever been there. It's right on the edge of an older part of Cairo called Darb al-Akmar, which is a very rundown, again, a kind of slum, as people call it. Al-Azhar Park had been a garbage dump for 1,000 years. And so it was right in the middle of this dense area. And all of these poor residents had no place to go. There was no place where they could gather. There were no green spaces, etc. And so as we were thinking about what could be done with this enormous space, it occurred to us that we could restore both some of the original city walls, but then actually turn it into an Islamic garden, which it would have had at the time. And one of the reasons for doing that was to allow a place for the local people to go and congregate. And so now when you go, you'll see wedding parties, you'll see families picnicking, and it's a cross section of Cairo. The same is actually true in Delhi. So for many of you who may have been to Humayun's tomb or a place called Sundar Nursery, right next to it is a place called Nizamuddin. And so again, Nizamuddin West, which is across or east rather, across the road. Nizamuddin East has traditionally been a very area, what do we call it in défavorisé, again, a kind of slum, they called it. Lots of very, very poor residents who were completely disconnected from both the tomb, the gardens, which were in a state of dilapidation. And so the whole idea was to actually link that population to those monuments. So we trained residents to work on the restoration, so to do the tile work, to do the restoration work on the dome, but also to work in the garden, in fact. And so that project has been going on since 1997, in fact. And so now there are whole generations of people that have been working on it. And the whole idea was that it would create a kind of economic but also social revitalization in the area.
Do you get feedback from people who come and use and visit your gardens?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we have, in Humayun's tomb and Sundar Nursery, there are a couple of million people a year who go. And I tell you, every time I meet somebody who's been to Delhi or from Delhi, it's wonderful because they've been there. It has become a destination. And so, people who will say, I had this lovely evening in the gardens, or we were there, and there's now this organic farmers market that there wasn't there before, or there was a concert, in the evening, or I went and I observed one of the 80 species of bird that was there that I never knew were in Delhi. We all know, well, some of us think of Delhi maybe outside as a very crowded place, maybe a smoggy place. You wouldn't necessarily associate it with nature. But you have this enormous green space in the...
Just this oasis in the middle.
Exactly. And that really was the vision. There's still a vision to see if we could one day link it up to the Purana Kila. And if you did that, if you stretched it all the way from kind of Humayun's tomb up through the Purana Kila, you would have a park that's about 4 times the size of Central Park. And so, again, we'll see if it'll happen someday, but it's not bad for what it is now.
I was going to say that some of the kind of things that have been raised, so for example, Antonia talking about lockdown and people having access to gardens and how they can be healing, and then Matt talking about these places that have been created for the public to be able to enjoy nature and plants and gardens. It feels important to be mindful that, especially in this country, access to gardens and access to nature isn't equal at all. And actually, I've made a note of some statistics so that I get it right. So for example, a person called Guy Shrubsole wrote a book a while ago called Who Owns England? And in it he notes that 50% of England is owned by less than 1% of the population, and that home owner share of land in England is less than 5%. And so actually, people's access to land generally is very minimal. But it's also an intersectional issue because in this country, people who are labelled BAME, black and minority ethnic people, have even less access to gardens and green space. So for example, black people are 4 times as likely as white people to have no access to outdoor space at home, whether that's a private garden or a shared garden, a patio or a balcony. And BAME communities are 60% less likely to be able to access green space, natural environments, and also 98% of black people in the UK live in urban locations. And so it's great that we kind of talk about gardening and how healing and nurturing it is, but the access to it is very unequal.
How do you increase the access to green spaces?
Oh my gosh, that is such a huge question. There is an organisation in the UK called the Right to Roam, and they are doing lots of campaigning around access to space. and they wrote, actually one of the things that's really interesting about what Matt talks about, when he's talking about these public gardens, they're public gardens, but sometimes they're owned by private people. It's just that the public are allowed to access them. And one of the things that I'm really interested about in decolonising, a large part of that is looking at the narratives that we live inside and the stories that we tell ourselves. And one of those stories is how we, in the West particularly, see ourselves as very separate from nature. We see humans as separate and superior, that nature is this thing that we can use to dominate and extract from. And one of the books that Right to Roam recently brought out, called Wild Service, looks at land as private property, for example, and how that actually, that is a source of our separation, because it excludes people from land. And it also, a place like a park that is privately owned, and we just allow people the privilege or luxury to go and use it, that is still a separation from nature, because we're consuming that as a resource. We're consuming it as leisure. It doesn't mean that there's like a reciprocal, deep relationship built over time, and that you're nurturing connection with that place.
I wanted to ask you about that, because we often talk about gardens in quite a passive way, that we go to them and we kind of receive the benefits of them, and whether there's a difference, because that is great in many ways, and you're still outside, you can still appreciate the aesthetic qualities of everything you're getting, but whether there is something more in having a very active relationship with a garden, be that cultivating it, creating it. And you have worked in community gardens, and you work with people gardening.
Yeah.
And what is it that you have seen in your experience?
I would say there are no simple and easy answers, and it's, the issues they run deep. So the way we think, the way we behave, the language we use, it's been instilled in us over a long time. And so actually part of decolonising is unpicking all of that, trying to understand those narratives that we're living inside. And even things as basic as the language that we use can reinforce that kind of separation and the lack of belonging, the lack of deep connection and relationship building. So just as an example, even using the words weeds, that's a very alienating and combative, kind of term, a bit like when we call insects pests, because we feel like they're damaging or eating the ornamental plants or plants that we're growing. And so I don't think it's an easy thing. And even if you're in a community gardening situation, it still requires intention and attention and a will to look at what it is you're nurturing, to question, why am I carrying out this act? For example, repeatedly mowing a lawn. Why are we doing that? When it uses fossil fuels, you create like a barren, almost a desert environment of a monocultural crop. And so that's why I talk about gardening as co-creation, because we're not the only beings in that space, enjoying that space, eating, feeding, whatever it is.
There's also, I guess, another layer to what you're saying, because when you give people the tools and the access to play their own part in creating a natural space and how they see it, as opposed to just receiving it, you do, in an emotional and quite profound context at times, feel something. And it's interesting what you were saying. I didn't know that you grew up in a council house, but I was homeless as a child and grew up also in social housing, and it was in London, so I did have access to parks, but I had such a yearning to have a garden, and we never had a garden. It was always concrete, and no one in my family understood this or realised this, and I desperately waited for the day when I would have a place that I could plant and grow and do it myself. And I don't know if any of you know that song Up on the Roof by the Drifters, but I used to listen to this repeatedly when I was about 15, and I would imagine having a roof terrace. And in lockdown, I did move to a place with a roof terrace, and it's tiny, but I grow roses and I grow basil and mint and honeysuckle. And I've there's definitely something I hadn't even realised until I did it about myself that you just learn to connect with. And every time I see a bud, I always think this is a sign that, things will die, but they rebloom again. And I wait for that moment. And in your exhibition, you have a lovely bit about sort of the history of people with no access to space and how they've been encouraged to sort of learn and to grow.
Yes. Well, actually, picking up on the thing about the community gardens, I mean, one of the key points in our exhibition, because gardening is a community activity, we thought it was important to work with communities, and we worked with two communities. We worked with a community called Cocoa Collective, which is based in South London, and also the Global Generation, which runs the Story Garden, which is out the back of St Pancras. And I think picking up on the point you're making about the bud and the season, something that comes to mind is these things take time. And Cocoa Collective was brought into being in 2020, and it's really only now that people are seeing the fruits of their labour. And perhaps one can make too much of activity in a garden, because one thing that was a revelation to me, because we have films from Cocoa Collective, but of course they talk about reconnecting with their heritage by growing their ancestral crops, and I think an important point to make is that by growing your own food, it gives you perhaps a sense of power, of empowerment, because if you're dependent on others for your food supply, obviously one can't be self-sufficient. I'm not saying that, but this sort of slight feeling of gaining something. But the point that was a revelation to me was that a lot of the people, the gardeners, said, when I come, I don't necessarily come to do anything. I come to sit. I come to listen to the birds. I come to feel the sort of sense of other people around me. And we think of gardening, it's a verb, it's an activity, but it can also be a sense of being, I think. And I think whether in a community garden, that is extremely important. Of course, we highlight the results of community gardens. I mean, in our exhibition we have, and also I would make the point that you talk about the creativity of your bud coming up. This spreads. Once you've got one area of creativity, you've got other areas. And for example, the Story Garden up the road has art classes, it has pottery classes, it unleashes a whole organic sense of creativity, if you like. It's not just this one focus on the gardening. But that again, it's taking time to evolve and develop, and thousands of people have passed through that garden in the last 3 years. Professionals in the area, homeless people, and it's a way. I mean, you were saying, what can we do about this lack of access to green space? It's not a perfect solution, and even community gardens have rules and regulations, but it's a leading out, it's a leading towards, and I feel that it's a promise of hope, if you like.
Matt, in a way, the purpose and accessibility of Islamic gardens, gardens of paradise, has been inverted, because they were historically very exclusive and walled off, and now you are reopening them up.
Absolutely. No, I that's certainly true. I mean, and you can see, I mean, in a way, if you think about what the garden was kind of originally, or let's say 1,000 years ago, this notion of, literally the paradise, which is a walled enclosure, was to keep the wild part out, right? So it was actually to sort of harness nature, in fact, and create this space where you could be contemplative precisely by keeping the wild parts out. Maybe that also meant keeping the wild people out, I suppose, in some of those instances. And now you do have almost an inversion of that. Nowadays, I think we think of gardens and certainly nature preserves and that sort of thing as a place where you maybe keep the nature and the wild part in. I mean, certainly that's the impetus behind the rewilding movement and those sorts of things, which I think is really, really important. This other idea where you want to invite people in, so that you create these, where it used to be the oasis was a place to get away from the harshness of the desert or the harshness of nature. Now we have these oases where you want to get away from the harshness of the city, actually, and reconnect with nature. That's been very much the experience in the places that we're working, whether it's in Cairo or Delhi or Hyderabad or Lahore. You know, people who in these urban areas need those spaces. Maybe I'll stop there because I mean, the other thing that we could talk about. Luckily, that's not my hand gestures that did that, but I'll stop there.
Just dismantle the stage.
Exactly.
I just wanted to pick up on a point because you made this very interesting observation just then that, you know, what is a weed and what is a pest? And actually, Antonia, you've looked at kind of in the exhibition the history of what people considered to be weeds and pests. So maybe you'd like to tell us a bit more about that because
yes.
It's fascinating.
I was drawing your attention to a manual of pests in the late 17th century, and the kind of things that were regarded as pests were ducks, otters, badgers, worms, earwigs, wasps, all the things that we would see as pollinators today. Were sort of conceived of as pests, and but then conversely, we've got a little spotlight on the dandelion, and it's interesting the history of the dandelion because we see it, or we're beginning to change now, but traditionally we've seen the dandelion as a weed, but in medieval times it was certainly not a weed, and it was grown in the monastery gardens, and it was used in salads, and then moving forwards, the dandelion was used for medicinal purposes. The sort of country term for dandelion is pissabed, and that's because it was used to encourage urination, and that was a very sort of long traditional use of the dandelion. And so it wasn't regarded as a weed at all, it was regarded as a useful plant. And now, I mean, not only do we realise that dandelions are great for your health because they've got a pack full of vitamins in there, but they are also great for pollinators because when you think about it, they bloom most of the year, they seed almost anywhere, their roots go down really deep, so they aerate the soil. And they're beautiful, so why a weed? And we were just, ending with a sort of comment, well, perhaps we should reevaluate the dandelion. But I mean, this whole concept, I quite take your point. I mean, weeds, it rather reminds me of that thing of dirt is only matter in the wrong place, this anthropologist point. And in a sense, you might say, what is a weed? Perhaps it's a flower in the wrong place, I don't know. But it's a very subjective judgment. And it's right for, go on.
Can I come in on that? So it's so interesting that, so one of the things that we do in addition to the historic city stuff is as the foundation, we work in rural communities in 15 countries. Every year we work with 60,000 community organizations, women's savings groups, and all sorts of things. So we work with thousands and thousands and thousands of farmers. And one of the things we're trying to get them to do is move away from heavily intensive tilling, use of fertilizers, which actually kills the soil. It eliminates the earthworms. You need more worms, you need more pollinators, etc. So in a strange sort of inversion, a couple of the things that, the techniques that we're working on, and that work in fact. So one is to create a kind of garden on the side or in the middle of your farm. And the garden is actually a wild space. So they're called Miyawaki forests. So it's a forest where literally you just take a handful of seeds, you spread them around, and there are multiple varieties of trees and other sort of plants and etc. So you create this little biodiversity hotspot in the middle of your farm. Now what that does is it means that you get more pollinators. By the way, you also stop tilling and that sort of thing, so you bring back the earthworms. But it can also, as the trees grow, then in fact it creates condensation. It creates a cool space for wildlife to have a refuge, etc. But by creating that condensation, you can actually work against drought. So you create, strangely, you're creating a wild garden, if I can put it that way, in the middle of your terraced and other space. And then the other thing that we've been doing is doing a lot of work with kitchen gardens. So that people in rural areas are actually surrounded by nature, so they don't necessarily think of gardening per se, but actually they have huge problems with malnutrition. And so again, these gardens can become ways for them to take charge of their own nutrition, diversify their diets, etc. That also has good effects for, I guess, not only for their health, but also for their local economies and for the health, if you will, of the soil.
I mean, in many ways, stating the obvious, but gardens are so multi-purpose in so many different ways. But they're also can be a microcosm for the societies they're in, and they tell that story, and they tell that particular context. And so I wondered what you thought about them as spaces of resistance, and can you live in a garden in a way that you would prefer to live outside of it?
I definitely think they're a site for us to explore those questions, and they're a place where we can challenge our assumptions and how we behave in the safety of kind of our own space. I mean, I know that's my relationship with my garden has changed a lot over time. When I first got a garden, it was so much of it was about appearances, and I'm not sure who for, I guess neighbours, visitors, oh my goodness, like I must keep it tidy, I must mow the lawn all the time, I must sweep the leaves all the time. And it can actually become quite overwhelming. People talk about gardening as this kind of pleasant, genteel, I don't know, rose-tinted activity, but it can actually be quite stressful.
It can be very few. It can make you cry when things invest time and effort.
Yeah, there's a ton of failure, multiple deaths.
Yes.
It's not all roses and kind of peaches and cream, strawberries and cream, and it's quite a challenging space. It makes you question things, and one of the things it made me question, and something that I still continuously ask myself, is why am I doing this? What made me want to garden in the first place? And somewhere in me, it was maybe kind of naively and superficially create a better world, or create a beautiful place. And are the actions I am taking, are they actually doing that? Or am I, in my naivety or kind of like trying to keep up appearances, am I actually destroying habitat? Am I spreading poison? Am I taking away nesting sites? Am I killing slow worms and ladybug larvae and glowworm larvae? I'm lucky, I kind of I have a garden that is full of all of these things. We have grass snakes, slow worms. I remember one time, because after a while it was like mowing this lawn is getting ridiculous, and so I decided to go down the meadow route, partly out of ease and all of these questions that I had in my head. And there was this one time when I'd mown paths through, and at the edge of a kind of bed area and the path was long grass. And my dad came one time, he's very keen on tidying up and being busy, and he trimmed that small area, and in that area he accidentally killed a slow worm, and it kind of really opened my eyes to why do we do this? Why do we keep doing this? We literally kill things and destroy, and that is a potential danger of one side of gardening. There's lots of beauty and nurturing and growing as well, but so I think it's a place where we can challenge and question, and it's a way. I love. She's an author and a botanist, Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she has a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and it's just the most beautiful. It's like a Bible and a hymn, and in it she talks about one of the things that she would recommend for people to do to repair their connection to earth and to build land connection is to grow a garden. And one of the things that she says it does is to kind of cultivate reverence and connection, and that is such a big part of what gardening has the potential to do, but it also asks difficult questions of us too. And one of the things for me, for example, that I also asked on top of all this stuff was about access and ownership, and I'm fortunate to have access and ownership of a beautiful garden, but not everyone does.
How has it changed how you are outside of your garden?
Yes, and that's one of the things in this Robin Wall Kimmerer quote too, is that she says, so it will cultivate reverence and connection, and these seeds go beyond your garden gates. They spread out into how you behave and speak and think. I think it's like a very long process, and I loved what Antonia was saying about time, because to me, that is one of the most healing things. Having done all this kind of breaking down of these narratives, for me, having my own garden, one of the most healing things is being able to take time and doing nothing. And so one of the things I love doing the most is being in my meadow area, now that I don't mow so much anymore, and just being. And it is one of the most healing, most connecting, most beautiful aspects of gardening for me personally.
One of the things that's really coming out amongst this discussion for me, and certainly comes out, I think, out of your exhibition, is there is no such thing as an ordinary garden or an ordinary person who gardens, because they each are unique and there's a completely different relationship and stories. And I do want to leave time for questions and answers, so I wondered if you could just very briefly tell us, because you look at some of the unheard voices of gardening in your exhibition, and I just wondered if you could very briefly tell the audience what you found.
Some of the unheard voices. Well, as being a curator of the Indie Office Records, I was particularly keen to draw out some of the stories of the unheard labourers who contributed towards these gardens. And for example, we have a petition of the head gardener to the Viceroy in the middle of the 19th century asking for more money. And this is an example of the power of cataloguing archives, by the way. You can dig down and find these stories. And it's the voice of a head gardener saying, you haven't given me enough money to live on, and the Viceroy signed off an increase, but we've got his name. And also the archives being the most documented archives of an organisation in history, we've got plant receipts for plant hunters who accompanied the botanists on their plant hunting expeditions, because one of the points I wanted to make was that people like Joseph Hooker and all the famous botanists could not have done any of this without the native plant hunters, whose names we don't know, except if you dig down into the archives, and lo and behold, you find some names. We also borrowed some very rare photographs from Edinburgh of plant hunters. So that's just a couple of examples of untold stories that one was trying to surface. But as you say, there's no such thing as a typical gardener, and we do also have, I don't know, going back to healing a little bit, because people look at the well-to-do gardeners we have in the exhibition, like John Evelyn, who had on the surface everything that you would expect. He was well connected, he had money, he had fame, he had sort of status in society. And you thought, well, it's all right for him to create his garden on the south of on the Thames. But just before he began to create his garden, his son died, and this absolutely devastated him. And there's a sort of feeling that this wonderful garden that he spent 30 years in creating was actually a sort of healing and restorative for him, for his son. So I suppose the point I'm making is one can't judge by the appearances of history, and even the well-connected, they would need the comfort and resource that gardening provides.
Thank you. I just would like to open it up to questions and answers, actually. If any of you do have any questions, I can move in mic.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. You know, it kind of raised issues in my mind about people's relationship with plants, especially from what you were saying about the braidwood,
Braiding sweetgrass.
Braiding sweetgrass book. So, in many ways, past and present, and how plants have become a commodity, right? And that commodification of plants, which happens with European colonization, from 1500, where they are searching for materia medica in the Indian Ocean, going around in ships, sending Cook's voyages, raiding, orchids from the Himalayas in Hooker's time and so on. So that commodification sort of destroys the relationship, even the Islamic perhaps relationship with plants. I saw this amazing tapestry in Yale of Lucknow before the mutiny, and it was just a sea of orchards. And it came to me from Michael Mann's work that the British actually prevented mangroves. They actually banned the cultivation of mangoes in UP in the 19th century. Why? I don't know. So this, and they were taxing everything, right? So what you're breaking then is the people's connection with nature. So I grew up in Delhi in an urban environment. I don't know how to plant anything, yeah. But my grandmother lived, in a sort of a coconut plantation with, there were cobras under the jasmine bush. My mother used to tell me, yeah. So that close association has been completely eroded. So I just wondered whether you could comment on the Islamic garden and its connections with nature. Whether the British connections with nature, of course they had botanic gardens in Calcutta and so on, that was different. And how do we, and to you, how do we reconnect? How do we, reconnect in ways in which those skills that we've lost can come back? Yeah.
Matt, do you want to comment on the Islamic gardens first?
Yeah, I'm trying to think a little bit about what that means. I mean, I suppose, the truth is that, there was enormous trade. As William's latest book, The Golden Road, shows, if you read Peter Frankopan's, book on the Silk Roads, there was actually enormous trade and exchange going from east to west, and certainly east to east. A lot of which was around, there's William right there. A lot of which, now I'm in dangerous territory. He's going to tell us all about. Where there was actually trade in plants, and in fact, a lot of these gardens, in fact, it was kind of the same thing, right? In other words, in a lot of these Islamic palaces, they were trying to collect plants from all different parts of the world and trying to show their prowess in being able to cultivate them and to learn medicinal uses, etc. I suppose what probably distinguishes that, maybe from the British period, would be the industrialization of that. So the massive exploitation of that in a way that then excluded others. So it's less about, say, taking examples of plants somewhere, learning how to do it yourself, etc., and more about just completely colonizing the use of those resources in a certain place, I presume, and then controlling the way that people engage with them. That strikes me as the difference in that. Maybe that's too rosy to the Mughal emperors and others, but that does seem to me to be a big difference.
So what about this idea that you can have generations of knowledge that, like the lady said, can just be lost in one generation?
That is what colonization does. It is a severing, and it is a separation of people from land. So the whole colonial project, what you were talking about, these voyages that went round and stole plants from one place, brought them back via botanic gardens generally. That is the root of a botanic garden, was as a colonial project of empire. It was an agent of empire. And then generally they would hybridize or, do something with the plants and then take them to one of their colonial outposts. So, for example, rubber from Brazil to India, tea from China to India, cinchona from was that Brazil or was that the Andes to India again? Obviously a great place to grow things, India. It is the key part of colonizing, is to take one thing and put it in another place. And in the process of doing that, you decimate what is there. So generally they were planted in plantations, and those plantations would involve annihilating, clearing land, and along with that you move people too, because you need people to work on the plantations via slavery or indentured labor. That separation is a key component of that.
I guess when you were talking earlier about this lack of access that a lot of people have to green spaces, there's also a lack of opportunity to learn, to relearn these skills.
Yes, and so, for example, if you look at the Right to Roam campaign, they would say that the answer is to go back to returns to the commons, and that you could possibly, there are people who say that you could trace a lot of these issues and capitalism to the enclosures, and when people were kicked off the land was enclosed and went into private ownership. And so an organisation like Right to Roam would say one of the routes towards restoring connection and relationship is to return to the commons. For me, I'm fortunate we've already had this conversation about access to land. I have access to a garden. And so for me, a large part of the work that I do in healing that separation is to build kinship. And so rather than this view of domination and extraction, It's how do I co-create this garden, and how do I begin to cultivate and see kin as opposed to nature, which is already a separating thing. So, for example, one of the things that really opened my eyes was when I went to the Oxford Real Farming Conference a few years ago, and there was a regenerative farmer there from Devon speaking. She's called Rebecca Hoskins, and she was talking about this separation. And there are cultures and languages that don't even have the word nature. There is no separation. You know, we are all part of an ecosystem, and so humans are not outside of that, but we've been placed outside of that so that we can extract and use and dominate. And so it's how do we repair that connection? How do we change the narratives? How do we build new stories to live inside of? Because we all live inside of stories.
Question there. There's a question here as well.
Hi, my question is for Matt. Just want to say thank you so much for what you've done at Humayun's Tomb and Sundar Nursery. I mean, the museum there is world class, and it's such an amazing experience.
Oh, thanks so much.
Just sort of jumping, sort of on the theme of the previous question, are there any plans for the Aga Khan Foundation to get involved with the gardens at the Taj Mahal to restore them to pre-colonial layouts?
No.
Oh,
The short answer is no.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay.
No.
Fair enough.
We tend to go where we're invited, and I think there are lots and lots of people who are already working with the government of India on Taj Mahal. So that's not one of the places. There's still lots for us to do in Hyderabad, still other things for us to do in Delhi, and so that's where we're focused there for now.
And there's a question over there.
So I was interested in the comments about access, and also the comments just made about the commodification. And I'm going to wind you up a bit, but I do like chips with my fish, for example. So I'm quite pleased the potato made it over from South America, and equally my Indian family enjoy drinking tea, so they're quite pleased that it made it over from China, and I like tomatoes in Italy as well. So also, just to get it out there, I'm very happy to mow the lawn, but I don't want to really till the soil, and I don't want to get muddy, you know. So I just wonder what the balance is between the idea that everyone sort of goes out and they're responsible for farming and milking, and, you know, because when you say a lot of land is owned by a small number of people, which quite a lot of that land is agricultural land, or it's barren land, or you know, whatever. So I just wanted to understand, because I think there's a risk that we get carried away a little bit, where you just end up in a kind of all capitalism is bad, all the noble savage, and it's all been downhill from there. Or even worse, Pol Pot, he sort of said we should all go back to the land as well.
So it's not about binaries, and it's not about either or. I think this is the other thing about colonization, is that it teaches us to be very binary, to be like, this is good and this is bad, this is right and this is wrong. It's how we've been brought up, and it's how we've been taught. And so it's about being able to hold complexity, and that there are elements of this that might be good and there are elements of this that might be bad. You know, it is not about never mowing. There are benefits to having lawn space. If you have young children who want to crawl about and play, if you want to play sports, you know, there are leisure activities that require a lawn. That is perfectly okay. So but it's not about doing away with lawns completely. That is not the solution. And so back to your point about recommoning, you know, there's this kind of idea that we hold as well in our society, that only certain people know how to care for the land, and that only certain people are responsible, and we don't want the rabble and the masses to look after the land. But look at where we are after several centuries of colonization. This country is one of the most nature depleted on the planet. We have biodiversity crashing. Climate crisis is real, and it's here. And, you know, this is all off the back of a system that we have been following for the last however many decades or centuries. And so actually I have some examples of from the State of Nature report from 2023. And, you know, in Great Britain, 1 in 6 species is at risk of being lost. For birds, that's 43%, amphibians and reptiles 31%, terrestrial mammals 26%, fungi and lichen 28%. And the overwhelming evidence is that this is due to human activity, and the two main factors that have contributed to that is the way that the land has been managed intensively for farming. So that's a large part of our land, and so the idea that it's being managed well by a few and that we should keep it like that is a complete falsehood. We are in trouble and we are in danger, and that is on the current system. And you know, when you go back to look at places that have been indigenously managed for a long time, they are not facing these same kinds of issues. The issues that we are facing are as a result of industrialization, and this is not to say that all industrialization is bad. Again, it's not about that binary, but that it is not all rosy, and the way that the current system is not working. Yeah, and so I think it's about holding complexity.
I suppose it's an interesting point you made though, because you said, I love mowing my garden, but I don't want to till the soil. And what's really interesting about that is that you have the option, right? So you have, no, I'm just saying, no, but it's just very interesting.
You don't want me farming.
That's okay, we don't all have to farm.
But what's lovely is you have the option to mow the lawn. And actually, I just wanted to bring Antonia in, because there's a lovely bit in your exhibition where I think it's from the sort of early 19th century, where one priest asks sort of the very poor in London who have no access to the outside space to garden, and it's fantastically popular, and so they take it up.
Yes, I suppose that's the 19th century sort of evangelical thrust, as it were, but nevertheless it had good results. This was a priest in Bloomsbury, which at that time was in very poorest of the slummiest area of London, and he encouraged his poorest parishioners to grow plants in their tenements, and some of these tenements had sort of light for only an hour a day. And what he did, I suppose this is very much in the spirit of the Victorian age, was to inculcate competition, and so there would be prizes for the best geranium and for the best sweet william. But it's interesting because that, funny enough, when you were talking about the commodification of plants, what struck me was part of another angle to that is actually the competitiveness of a lot of plants. I mean, a lot of plants are grown so very unnecessarily, just for the sake of competition, growing the biggest geranium or whatever. I mean, it's an enormous environmental waste in that. But going back to the vicar in Bloomsbury, it started off a whole sort of the fashion for local flower shows, and from a very small beginning just up the road here. So no, I mean, I'm not quite sure what the sort of shape of it was. You were saying.
Well, I was simply making the point that having the access has been a repetitive theme in history.
And certainly access can come in many forms, and this, say, rather sort of paternalistic idea was that you could still have your access even in your room. But I mean that still pertains today. We can all grow house plants. So, but it's not quite the access that we have we're discussing in wider terms, and I quite agree with you.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to draw this session to a close. But thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Matt, Sue, and Antonia.